There are scandals, there are quiet rumors, and then there are moments that shake the core of an institution as old as the British monarchy. Over the centuries, the royal family has endured wars, betrayals, public divorces, abdications, and internal crises, events that would cripple almost any other institution. Yet nothing truly prepared them for the storm that was quietly gathering within their own walls. This wasn't the work of a political enemy or an external threat. It was a betrayal from the inside, one so deliberate, so calculated, that it would go on to spark one of the most explosive and divisive chapters in modern royal history. Before we dive deeper, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. At the center of this unfolding storm was Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, a figure who has long divided public opinion. From the moment she stepped into the royal spotlight through her marriage to Prince Harry, she became a symbol of both admiration and controversy. To many, she represented a bold, modern force challenging the monarchy's outdated traditions. To others, she appeared as a calculated disruptor, someone with her own ambitions, navigating royal life on her own terms. But even her staunchest critics likely didn't anticipate this: allegations that Meghan had secretly recorded private conversations during royal family meetings. These weren't casual chats, they were high-level discussions involving national matters, family dynamics, and deeply personal issues meant to remain behind closed doors. And this betrayal didn't unfold in a heated moment driven by emotion. It happened in spaces where trust was assumed, where discretion was expected, making the alleged act all the more stunning. It all took place within the most secure and revered spaces of the monarchy: Buckingham Palace, Kensington Palace, and Windsor Castle. These weren't just physical locations, they were fortresses of tradition, safeguarded not only by guards in uniform but by generations of silent protocols and unspoken expectations. In these halls, confidentiality wasn't just customary, it was sacred. But for the first time in the modern era, that sacred trust had been breached. Like many scandals, this one began with a whisper of doubt. Princess Anne, the no-nonsense, fiercely loyal daughter of Queen Elizabeth II, had always been known for her sharp intuition, military discipline, and unwavering sense of duty. And quietly, she began to notice something wasn't adding up. Certain remarks made behind closed doors were surfacing elsewhere, private jokes echoed in public commentary, sensitive decisions somehow reaching the tabloids days after being discussed among a select few. At first, the strange coincidences were dismissed. But Princess Anne doesn't rely on assumptions, she trusts her instincts. And this time, her instincts were sounding the alarm. One evening, after a particularly sensitive strategy meeting with King Charles and the senior royals, she made an unusual request: she asked that the room be swept. It wasn't paranoia. It was a deep, unshakable feeling that something wasn't right. Security was called in to investigate. They found something that clearly didn't belong. Hidden beneath a polished wooden table was a small, nearly undetectable black device. A recording unit. It wasn't part of the palace's official security system. It hadn't been logged by staff. And it certainly wasn't the kind of equipment accidentally left behind. The discovery sent a chill through the room. Who had planted it? Why? What had it captured, and more importantly, who had listened? Before anyone could fully process the shock, another revelation came to light. This wasn't a one-off. Additional rooms were swept, and similar devices were uncovered, each carefully hidden, each expertly positioned to avoid detection. They were so discreet that only trained professionals could have spotted them. The atmosphere inside the palace shifted instantly. What began as a faint suspicion now escalated into a full-blown internal investigation. The trust that once bound these historic walls had been replaced by unease, and a sense that nothing was as secure as it once seemed. The royal family, often criticized for their secrecy, suddenly found themselves doing something rare: looking inward. What had once been a fortress of privacy was now under internal scrutiny, and the investigation wasn't aimed at the outside world. It was focused on their own ranks. As inquiries deepened, one name kept resurfacing. One individual whose presence at confidential meetings consistently aligned with the suspected timing of the recordings. A family member who, despite her outward grace and finely tuned public persona, had reportedly become more distant, reserved, and increasingly elusive. Meghan. A comprehensive internal investigation was swiftly launched, not just by palace officials, but with the support of private security professionals, some with intelligence backgrounds and ties to MI5. According to sources familiar with the probe, the findings quickly mounted. Devices were traced back to purchases made through encrypted online vendors. Evidence of tampering was discovered in parts of the palace's internal camera system, irregularities that coincided almost exactly with Meghan's private movements and schedule. The deeper they looked, the more the pieces seemed to fit. It was discreet. Sophisticated. But to those trained to detect such things, it was unmistakable, betrayal concealed beneath a veneer of silence. And this is where the revelations took an even more unsettling turn. Because this wasn't just about personal secrets or family gossip. The royal family is not simply a group of ceremonial figures hosting garden parties. They are intimately connected to the British government, military leadership, and international diplomacy. They receive regular briefings on matters of national security. They play key roles in maintaining Commonwealth ties. Their conversations often include sensitive, high-level information, discussions that, if exposed, could influence diplomatic relations or jeopardize national safety. So if Meghan truly was recording these private moments, the question becomes unavoidable: why? Was it for a memoir? A private archive? Leverage? Perhaps a secret media project waiting to be sold? Or was it something far more serious? The palace couldn't afford to wait for that answer. The breach was already too deep. Trust, which had already been strained within the family, had now completely broken. Princess Anne, known for her unflinching sense of duty, reportedly demanded swift and unequivocal action. King Charles, ever measured in crisis, recognized this was not a scandal that could be quietly managed or contained. Prince William, already estranged from Harry and Meghan over a series of previous disputes, was said to have responded with a calm but intense fury. And Queen Camilla, according to those present, was left stunned into silence. For a fleeting moment, it wasn't just a scandal the royal family was confronting, it was the very real threat of implosion from within. What came next was nothing short of historic, an extraordinary private summit, one of the most consequential royal meetings in recent memory. Behind closed doors, without the eyes of the press or the clicks of cameras, Meghan was called in to face the senior royals. It was not a conversation. It was a reckoning. By then, she was no longer seen as a family member under pressure, but as a threat to the institution itself. The evidence was laid out before her. According to palace insiders, her response was scattered, partial denials, vague explanations, and deflections of blame. She claimed misunderstanding, misinterpretation. But it was too late. The decision had already been made. There would be no sympathy. No negotiation. Meghan had crossed a line that few within the monarchy had ever dared approach. She was officially, and permanently, cut off. Her titles were stripped. Her security detail withdrawn. All formal ties to the royal family were erased. From that moment forward, she was no longer recognized as part of the institution, not in the public eye, not in private dealings, and certainly not within the power structure she once moved through. As for Prince Harry, his future now hung in the balance, tied directly to the choices he would make in the critical hours and days that followed. Would he stand by her, or stay loyal to the family that had raised him? Would he defend her choices or quietly retreat into silence, burdened by regret? Before we examine the decisions Harry made and how Meghan's alleged betrayal continued to unravel, before we explore the mounting evidence, how Princess Anne emerged as the unlikely force behind the investigation, and what all of this means for the monarchy's future, there's something more important to understand. This isn't just a story about hidden recorders. It's a story about power, who holds it, who threatens it, and what happens when someone within the system dares to challenge its boundaries. It's about legacy, tradition, and loyalty, and the invisible lines no one is meant to cross. To truly grasp the magnitude of what happened, we need to go back to the beginning and peel away the layers of a scandal far more explosive than anyone imagined. Because the truth, as it turns out, is more unsettling, and more dangerous, than anyone expected. It all began with a whisper. A vague, lingering suspicion that something wasn't quite right. Inside the opulent halls of Buckingham Palace, behind gilded doors and centuries-old tapestries, that suspicion began to grow. It didn't come from anything obvious. At first, it was just a feeling. A subtle shift in body language when certain topics were raised. Quiet, knowing glances exchanged during high-level meetings. A creeping realization that conversations meant to stay confidential were somehow finding their way into the outside world. At first, those in the know dismissed it as the usual palace leaks, inevitable for any institution living under a microscope as closely watched as the British royal family. Maybe it was just a loose-lipped staff member. Maybe a journalist had stumbled onto a source. That's what some told themselves at first. But as time went on, the coincidences became harder to ignore. Tabloid headlines began using phrases that had been spoken only in private palace meetings. Comments made in jest, personal, light-hearted, and deeply confidential, were now appearing in the press, twisted into sensational soundbites designed to spark controversy and sell stories. Princess Anne had witnessed enough royal scandals in her lifetime to know when something didn't feel right. She had been raised in an environment where discretion was paramount and where broken trust was rarely, if ever, forgiven. Coincidences, especially when tied to matters of security, were not something she was inclined to accept. While others in the family chalked the leaks up to misfortune or random chance, and saw the pattern clearly. Her instincts, sharpened by years of service and observation, told her something was very wrong. The turning point came after a high-stakes meeting among the senior royals, where they discussed the monarchy's image and strategic future following the death of Queen Elizabeth II. It was a closed-door session, no aides, no advisors, no media. Just immediate family. And yet, that same evening, a royal correspondent released a startlingly detailed report that mirrored nearly everything said in that room. The article quoted sentiments and even phrases that had been spoken only during that private meeting. At that point, there was no room left for denial. Someone had been listening. Without drawing attention to her suspicions, Princess Anne discreetly requested a full security sweep of the meeting space. There was no drama, no public statement, just a quiet move to confirm what her instincts had already told her. She needed to know who had broken the unspoken rules of the royal circle. The sweep was conducted quietly, in the early hours of the morning, when the palace halls were still and staff movement was minimal. That's when the first device was found, carefully hidden beneath the edge of a conference table, seamlessly embedded near a decorative wood panel that blended perfectly with the surroundings. It was tiny, no larger than a lipstick cap, and nearly invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically trained to find it. Its design was deceptively simple, matte black, blending effortlessly into the dark oak grain of the furniture. But it was far more than a basic recording device. It was equipped with Bluetooth capabilities and its own miniature data storage drive. This wasn't a cheap gadget bought off the shelf, it was high-grade, discreet surveillance equipment. Someone had invested time, money, and effort to ensure it would go unnoticed. But now it had been discovered, and everything changed. Initially, the discovery was tightly contained. Palace officials feared that if word got out, the media storm would be unmanageable. More troubling, however, was the diplomatic risk. Discussions in those rooms weren't just about family matters, they included sensitive topics related to foreign governments, state visits, and national security. If such recordings were ever leaked, the consequences wouldn't stop at public scandal. They could destabilize international relationships or even compromise intelligence coordination between the UK and its allies. This was no longer just a personal betrayal, it was teetering on the edge of a full-blown security crisis. A broader sweep was immediately ordered, targeting every room that had hosted private family meetings in recent months. Within 48 hours, 4 additional devices were uncovered. 2 at Windsor Castle. One at Kensington Palace. Another inside a private study at Clarence House. Each one had been concealed with expert precision, inside a decorative vase, behind a loose fireplace panel, even embedded within a lamp recently gifted to the family, disguised as an innocuous design piece. Investigators began mapping the pattern. Who had access to all these locations? Who had been present at every meeting where a device was later found? Whose movements aligned with both the timing of the leaks and the locations of the hidden equipment? The answer kept pointing to one person. Meghan Markle. She had been present at every single gathering under investigation. She had been alone in several of the rooms in the moments just before meetings began. She had even requested private time in the study prior to one of the key discussions, saying she needed to gather her thoughts. At the time, no one questioned it. Now, in hindsight, it looked like something else entirely. Why would anyone have questioned her? She was family, or at least, she had been. But now, every private moment Meghan had been granted was being viewed through a much different lens. Had she used those solitary moments to plant surveillance equipment? Was she working alone, or did someone help her? And most unsettling of all, was Harry aware of any of it? The answers weren't yet clear, but the mounting evidence was quickly drowning out the silence. Palace security began combing through archived surveillance footage. Meghan's movements were reviewed in painstaking detail across several days. In one clip, she was seen adjusting an ornate picture frame in a corridor just outside a meeting room. That frame, upon inspection, concealed one of the listening devices behind its backing. In another recording, she returned alone to a meeting space after everyone else had departed, explaining she had left her phone behind. Her demeanor never raised suspicion. She was calm, composed, nothing that would have triggered concern. But once investigators knew what to look for, those moments took on a new significance. Still, speculation wasn't enough. The palace needed definitive proof, something undeniable, something that could tie Meghan directly to the planted devices. So they devised a plan. A false meeting was scheduled. Everything about it was a fabrication, crafted to sound convincing, but with no real intent for it to take place. Meghan was deliberately allowed to overhear details about the time and location. The room was prepared, motion detectors installed, hidden cameras added with more subtlety than usual. The trap was set. Sure enough, that night, the room was entered. The sensors picked up movement. Hidden cameras captured the moment Meghan placed an object beneath the armrest of a chair. When security later retrieved the item, it was confirmed to be another recording device, identical in design to the others previously uncovered. There was no longer room for doubt. The footage, though never released publicly, was reportedly shown during an emergency Royal Council meeting. Sources described the reaction as a mix of stunned silence, disbelief, and rising anger. Meghan was no longer a suspect, she was considered responsible. The tone within the palace changed instantly. Princess Anne, who had been at the forefront of the quiet investigation, is said to have addressed the room with measured, icy calm. She reportedly insisted on immediate action, reminding everyone that in the royal family, loyalty isn't about affection, it's about protecting the institution's survival. The British monarchy has weathered centuries of upheaval, wars, assassinations, betrayals, but this was different. This was an internal breach of trust so profound that even the oldest institution in the nation found itself shaken. This wasn't something they could quietly recover from. This was sabotage from within. Not everyone in the room maintained composure. Prince William, reportedly overwhelmed with fury, slammed his hand on the table and demanded to know how it had ever gotten this far. His anger wasn't just about the act itself, it was about the betrayal of the very foundation they'd all sworn to protect. King Charles, by contrast, remained largely silent, absorbing the weight of the evidence with slow, deliberate nods, his expression unreadable. In one corner, Queen Camilla was said to have wept quietly, devastated not just by the scandal, but by the personal betrayal it represented. But it was Prince Harry's reaction that left the room in a kind of suspended uncertainty. Some present claimed he sat emotionless, staring ahead in disbelief, unwilling, or perhaps unable, to accept what he was hearing. Others suggested he had known something was wrong all along, and had simply hoped the truth would never surface. Whatever the reality, his silence said more than any words could. The final act came quickly. Meghan was summoned to a closed-door meeting with the senior royals. She was presented with the evidence, clear, documented, undeniable. She denied any wrongdoing. She insisted she was being framed. She challenged the validity of the footage. But her denials fell flat. The decision had already been made. Her defense, once powerful in its ability to control narratives, no longer held sway. The royal family had reached its conclusion, and they were moving forward without her. Behind the grandeur of public ceremonies, the royal parades, and those polished appearances on palace balconies lies the true core of the British monarchy, its private meetings. These aren't the glittering galas or highly publicized charity events most people associate with royal life. They are serious, discreet, and often solemn gatherings where personal family dynamics intersect with state affairs. These meetings go far beyond the warmth of family reunions. They function as operational briefings, strategic discussions, and high-stakes negotiations about power and influence. For generations, they have served as the foundation of how the monarchy quietly governs itself behind the scenes. Attendance is strictly limited to the most senior and trusted members of the royal household. Their purpose isn't to plan birthdays or decide on dinner menus. These sessions are where the future of the monarchy is shaped, where roles are assigned, diplomatic strategies are mapped out, key engagements are prioritized, and plans are made to handle delicate tensions within the Commonwealth. More recently, they've become crisis response hubs, dealing with the constant pressure of media scrutiny in an age where every misstep is amplified online. To outsiders, the royal family often appears like a flawless PR machine, seamlessly adjusting to public opinion. But that illusion of ease is built on tireless behind-the-scenes coordination, countless hours of internal planning, and no shortage of intense debate. These meetings are the monarchy's war rooms, where survival strategies are crafted in a time when many question whether the institution still belongs in the modern world. Following Harry and Meghan's decision to step back from their royal duties, these internal meetings took on even more significance. With the family's roster of working royals shrinking, King Charles, Prince William, Queen Camilla, and Princess Anne found themselves not only absorbing the additional workload, but also carrying the burden of navigating a deeply divided public. They were now the face of a monarchy caught between preserving tradition and projecting progress. And after the now infamous 2021 interview Meghan and Harry gave, one that aired private grievances and exposed deep internal rifts, those meetings became more than just strategy sessions. They were recovery efforts. The meetings Meghan is now accused of secretly recording weren't casual chats over tea. They were sensitive, high-level discussions, conversations that shaped how the monarchy would present itself in a post-Brexit Britain, and how it would weather the backlash of an increasingly skeptical global audience. These weren't just routine meetings, they were critical crisis management sessions. Topics ranged from the fallout of Prince Andrew's scandals to emergency strategies following damaging headlines. But more importantly, they included conversations that struck at the core of the monarchy's future: who would take on which roles, how the public narrative would be shaped, and what steps would be necessary to keep the institution relevant in the modern era. And despite stepping back from official duties, Meghan was often present during these briefings. Sometimes her attendance came as a courtesy, extended in good faith. Other times, it was simply by association, accompanying Prince Harry, who at that point still retained certain privileges and ties to the inner workings of the palace. According to insiders, Meghan would usually remain quiet, rarely speaking unless addressed directly, but always observant, deeply focused on everything being said. Initially, her presence didn't raise any red flags. She was still considered part of the family, and her quiet attentiveness was seen as respect. But now, in hindsight, that same focused silence has become a source of unease. Especially considering the nature of the information shared during those meetings. In one session, senior royals reportedly discussed the delicate process of transitioning power from the late Queen Elizabeth II to King Charles III. Those discussions involved highly sensitive matters, logistics surrounding royal tours, allocations from the sovereign grant, and confidential diplomatic considerations. Had any of this information been leaked or, worse, sold to outside interests, the fallout would have extended beyond tabloid headlines. It could have triggered formal investigations and intense government scrutiny. Another meeting is said to have focused on Prince William's expanding role and how he and Catherine would be positioned as the face of a new era. There were conversations about shifting Charles and Camilla into a more traditional, behind-the-scenes role, an evolution that would require careful coordination and impeccable timing. If those internal strategies had been made public prematurely, they would have unraveled months of careful planning. Even more alarming were the meetings that touched on matters of national security. While the royal family doesn't set policy, they are regularly briefed on high-level issues, especially those involving state visits or politically sensitive international engagements. Meghan would have had access to discussions about military ceremonies, travel security logistics, and the monarchy's delicate role in Commonwealth nations such as Canada, Australia, and various African states, where royal appearances are deeply symbolic, yet politically charged. There were also intimate, vulnerable conversations shared in those rooms, private worries about Harry and Meghan's emotional well-being, concerns about the growing distance between William and Harry, Queen Elizabeth's personal hopes for a family reconciliation, and Charles's deep unease over the public response to their explosive interviews. These weren't trivial matters. They were the monarchy's most guarded truths, and they were shared in what was meant to be a space of absolute trust. The emotional weight carried in those meetings was immense. Senior members of the royal family reportedly expressed deep sorrow over the growing divide within their ranks. Princess Anne, typically composed and unshakably calm, was said to have struggled to hold back tears during one session, voicing her concern that the entire ordeal might undermine the public's faith in the integrity of the monarchy. Queen Camilla, often a target of intense media criticism, shared that she had felt increasingly isolated amidst the relentless coverage. Prince William, too, is said to have opened up in a rare moment of vulnerability, speaking not of grief from a death, but from the emotional loss of a brother he believed had been influenced and led astray. And through all of this, Meghan reportedly remained silent. She observed. And, as it was later discovered, she recorded. A palace aide, speaking under strict anonymity, described the situation as a fox in the henhouse. Not because of anything Meghan said at the time, but because of what she was suspected of doing behind the scenes. The act of secretly recording wasn't viewed merely as a breach of privacy. It was seen as a violation of the monarchy's unspoken but sacred code, a code grounded in discretion, loyalty, and trust, even in moments of internal disagreement. To grasp the gravity of the breach, one must understand just how protected these meetings are. Even senior aides are often barred from attending. No transcripts are kept. Mobile phones are strictly prohibited. Those present are expected to treat every word spoken as confidential, no matter the topic. This deep-seated trust, built not just over years but across generations, is what allows the royal household to function behind closed doors. And to have that trust shattered, not by the media, not by an outsider, but by someone they still considered part of the family, was regarded as more than just betrayal. It was a fundamental violation. The content of those meetings helps explain why the royal response was so decisive. This wasn't about avoiding headlines or dodging embarrassment. It was about defending the very foundation of the monarchy, protecting sensitive state matters, preserving national interest, and honoring the emotional vulnerability of individuals who believed that, within those rooms, their words were safe. The question that hung over everything was one of intent. If Meghan had been secretly recording those meetings, what did she plan to do with the material? Was it destined for another Netflix-style documentary, similar to the ones she and Harry had already produced? Would it be used as leverage in future legal negotiations or financial disputes? Or, in the darkest interpretation, was it all part of a long-term plan to slowly dismantle the image of the monarchy from within? The royal family couldn't afford to wait for the answer. Those meetings were never intended for public consumption. They were private by design, spaces where strategy was discussed, grievances aired, and support quietly offered behind the polished exterior the world sees. Meghan's decision to record them, if true, didn't just cross a line. It shattered a core pillar of royal life: confidentiality. In a family steeped in ritual, silence, and restraint, the breach felt seismic. Princess Anne has long stood apart within the royal family, not because she resisted the institution, but because she represented its essence with unwavering consistency. While others garnered headlines or became symbols of modern reform, Anne remained its foundation, steadfast, private, and unflinching. When the monarchy's internal trust was compromised, it wasn't Charles, or William, or even the Queen in her final years who took the lead, it was Anne, stepping forward to uphold the old code. Born in 1950, Princess Anne was raised in a world where duty wasn't optional, it was embedded into every facet of daily life. Unlike her brothers, she was never in line for the throne, but she quickly earned a reputation as one of the most dependable and hardworking members of the royal family. She never chased publicity, never demanded attention. Her influence came not from spectacle, but from persistence. She represented the crown not with pageantry, but with purpose. To Anne, monarchy was never about prestige, it was about responsibility. And that same ethos shaped her response to Meghan's alleged betrayal. She didn't react with emotion. She responded with resolve. From the moment she noticed irregularities, unusual press leaks, oddly timed headlines, subtle changes in palace dynamics, and began to pay closer attention. Quietly. Methodically. Relentlessly. While others speculated, whispered, or tried to keep the peace, Princess Anne remained focused. Her military training and lifelong experience in diplomacy had taught her to observe first, act later. And what she observed disturbed her. She had never been especially close to Meghan, their personalities clashed from the beginning. Anne was direct, allergic to theatrics, and firmly anchored in tradition. Meghan, by contrast, was expressive, modern, and media-savvy. But Anne had managed to coexist with plenty of royals she didn't see eye to eye with over the years. Personality differences weren't the issue. What caught Anne's attention now was behavior. She began to notice that Meghan was often seated centrally during important meetings, despite no longer being an active royal. She noted how Meghan frequently had reasons to enter private areas of the palace unaccompanied. How she would linger after meetings, standing near doors or hanging back when others had already left. And perhaps most unsettling, she noticed how private, detailed, and emotionally nuanced information, things only shared behind closed doors, began appearing in the media. These weren't generic leaks, these were highly specific stories, too precise to have come from anyone outside the room. And began quietly keeping track. She documented dates, meeting locations, and the corresponding media coverage that followed. A pattern began to emerge: too many overlaps, too many coincidences. And when the hidden recording devices were discovered, Anne was the one who instantly made the connection. She was furious, but she didn't show it. There was no shouting. No emotional outburst. She simply took control. And ordered a comprehensive sweep of all royal residences. She bypassed palace protocol and brought in independent security experts with discreet links to government agencies. She didn't brief the royal household. She didn't involve aides or advisors. Only those absolutely essential to the investigation knew what was happening. She treated it like a military operation, quiet, controlled, exacting. As the evidence began to pile up, Anne arranged a confidential meeting with King Charles, Prince William, and Queen Camilla. She laid everything out with clarity and structure: surveillance footage, timestamps, locations of the recording devices. Her briefing was methodical, clinical, and left no room for doubt. According to palace insiders, the room was still when she finished. Camilla had tears in her eyes. William's jaw was clenched. Charles sat pale and silent, stunned by the betrayal. But Anne didn't pause to comfort or console. She leaned forward, unwavering, and asked the only question that mattered: what are we going to do about this? To Princess Anne, the monarchy was never just a ceremonial institution, it was a delicate inheritance passed through generations, now under direct threat. She made it absolutely clear, inaction would be interpreted as weakness, not only by the public but by future generations. If the royal family couldn't defend itself from within, how could it expect the loyalty of the nation? In her view, Meghan's continued association with the institution was no longer acceptable. Not socially. Not ceremonially. Not through titles, nor privilege. For Anne, the evidence spoke for itself. Meghan's motives, whether personal, financial, or political, were irrelevant. What mattered was the act, secretly recording private royal meetings. That, to Anne, was an irredeemable violation. What distinguished Anne in that moment was her emotional detachment. While others felt devastated, shocked, or conflicted, and remained focused. She wasn't fueled by revenge or emotion. She wasn't interested in apologies or justifications. Her only concern was preserving the integrity of the monarchy. Insiders say this unwavering focus gave Anne the moral authority to lead when others were still hesitant. Gradually, the rest of the family aligned with her. William, initially cautious about escalating the situation and worsening family tensions, began to support her position. Camilla, though clearly hurt, offered a quiet nod of agreement. And Charles, after days of private reflection, conceded. Anne's reasoning was unshakable. What came next was a deliberate and tightly controlled internal process to sever Meghan's remaining ties to the royal institution. Anne personally oversaw key aspects, drafting private correspondence, coordinating with legal advisors, and ensuring that every step was handled with precision. There would be no public spectacle, no tabloid-fueling fallout. Anne insisted on something far more powerful, a quiet, final, and absolute withdrawal. Behind the scenes, Meghan's titles were revoked. Her access to royal residences and events was rescinded. Security clearances were stripped. Financial support funneled through palace channels was terminated. And ensured every document was signed, every protocol followed, and every link severed. And when the time came for Meghan to be summoned for one final meeting, it was Anne who sat across from her, composed, direct, and unflinching. The message was unmistakable. It was over. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't soften her words with polite reassurances. Princess Anne delivered the decision with the composure and precision of someone issuing a military directive, measured, unwavering, and final. According to insiders who witnessed the meeting, Meghan attempted to explain, to defend herself, to suggest there had been some misunderstanding. But Anne remained immovable. She is said to have calmly stated, "You knew what you were doing. Now you know the consequences." There was no drama, no emotional flair, just the quiet authority of someone performing necessary surgery. As one aide described it, it was like a surgeon removing a tumor before it could do more damage. In the days that followed, Princess Anne earned quiet admiration from palace staff. Many had long respected her dedication, but this act, decisive and disciplined, turned that respect into reverence. Some were surprised by how quickly she acted. Others were simply relieved that someone had finally taken the matter seriously and handled it with the gravity it demanded. Outwardly, the changes were subtle at first. Meghan's image began to disappear from official royal materials. Her titles were quietly removed from the monarchy's website. Invitations to upcoming royal engagements no longer included her name. But inside palace walls, the message was unmistakable, and had drawn a line, and now everyone knew not to cross it. This moment solidified Anne's legacy in a way few had predicted. No longer just the steadfast royal working diligently in the background, she emerged as the monarchy's enforcer, a defender of tradition, a protector of the crown's inner sanctum, and the steady hand that took charge when things threatened to fall apart. She didn't ask for praise. She didn't speak to the press. She did what she believed needed to be done. From the very beginning, Meghan Markle's arrival in the royal family had drawn intense interest, equal parts admiration, intrigue, and skepticism. Her journey from Hollywood actress to Duchess of Sussex wasn't just rapid, it was revolutionary. To some, she represented the fresh, modern face the monarchy desperately needed. Modern, multicultural, and fiercely independent, these were the qualities that made Meghan Markle such a compelling figure to many. But inside the palace, her rapid rise triggered something different: unease. Some within the institution began to wonder whether Meghan's role wasn't about serving the monarchy, but reshaping it to suit her own vision. So when the news broke that she had allegedly recorded private royal meetings, it didn't just spark headlines, it ignited a media firestorm and a wave of public speculation. The central question quickly shifted from did she do it? To why would she do it? And with that, a flood of theories rushed in. Many pointed immediately to ambition. Before joining the royal family, Meghan had carved out a successful career in the entertainment industry. She had starred in a major television show, developed a growing reputation in advocacy work, and steadily built a public identity grounded in activism and visibility. To achieve that kind of success in such a competitive space takes drive, strategic thinking, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. Critics argued that those traits didn't disappear after her wedding to Prince Harry; in fact, they may have intensified. Some insiders speculated that Meghan viewed the royal family not as a final destination, but as a launchpad, an unmatched global platform that could propel her into a new level of influence far beyond what Hollywood could offer. Unlike other royals who rise quietly through decades of service, Meghan's detractors claimed she tried to accelerate that path, through image control and, potentially, leverage. If the reports are true, the recordings could have served as just that, leverage. Not necessarily for immediate use, but as something to keep in her back pocket, just in case. Others saw her strategy as even broader. With Meghan and Harry's move to California, followed by multimillion-dollar deals with Netflix, Spotify, and a string of headline-making interviews, it appeared she was building a brand independent of the monarchy. In that context, access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content from one of the world's most private institutions would be invaluable, not just financially, but politically. There was also the idea of protection. Life within the royal family had reportedly been tense for Meghan from the start: conflicts over protocol, relentless media scrutiny, and strained relationships behind palace walls. Some believe she may have started recording as a safeguard. If ever accused publicly, she could use the recordings to defend herself, to provide context, or to expose internal dysfunction. But this theory starts to unravel when you consider the scope of what was allegedly captured. These weren't private conversations involving Meghan directly. These were high-level discussions about national interests, family dynamics, and internal royal security matters. If self-protection was her goal, why record meetings in which she barely participated? That question leads to a far more unsettling possibility, that the motive may have been something darker. A theory that few want to consider, but one that is becoming harder to ignore: espionage. Though it might sound extreme at first, a handful of commentators, and even some former intelligence officials, have quietly floated the possibility. The British royal family, after all, isn't just a ceremonial institution, it's one deeply entwined with diplomacy, military protocol, and international affairs. While not a governing body, its influence is vast and global. If confidential discussions held within palace walls were somehow shared, accidentally or otherwise, with outside entities, organizations, or political groups, the consequences could be significant. To be clear, this theory doesn't accuse Meghan of collaborating with foreign governments. Rather, it raises a broader concern: by possessing highly sensitive information without the protection of the royal security network, she may have unknowingly exposed herself as a target. Once Meghan and Harry stepped back from their official roles, they lost many of the security privileges that came with being working royals, including diplomatic immunity. Any private documents, recordings, or notes they retained were no longer shielded in the same way, making them vulnerable to theft, exploitation, or misuse. Still, others believe Meghan's motivations weren't about espionage or politics, but something much more personal. According to sources close to the palace, her actions may have been driven by resentment. Despite the grandeur of the royal wedding, Meghan's entry into the family was reportedly anything but smooth. She often felt isolated, misunderstood, and scrutinized, both by the press and the institution itself. She struggled to navigate a system built on strict hierarchy and ancient customs, where every word and gesture was bound by unwritten codes. Privately, Meghan was said to have expressed frustration about being sidelined, about not being allowed to speak openly, and about feeling more like a guest than a fully accepted member of the family. For someone who had spent much of her adult life building a platform rooted in voice, advocacy, and empowerment, the constraints of royal life may have felt suffocating. Seen from that perspective, the recordings might have been her way of regaining control, a quiet form of resistance. If she couldn't speak freely in the room, perhaps she could find a way to speak later, on her own terms. And then, of course, there's the question of Prince Harry. What did he know? Was he complicit? Did he help facilitate the recordings? Or was he unaware, left in the dark like the rest of the family? That remains unclear. Some believe Harry at least suspected something. Others argue Meghan acted on her own, perhaps convincing herself it was necessary for their protection or future security. Either way, the emotional toll on Harry cannot be overlooked. He had already been grappling with a painful divide, torn between his loyalty to the family he was born into and his deep love for the woman he chose to build a life with. If Meghan's actions forced Harry into yet another impossible decision, the psychological strain would be immense. And the speculation doesn't stop there. Some political observers have suggested that Meghan's ambitions might stretch beyond entertainment and philanthropy. With her connections in the US, experience in advocacy, and skill as a public speaker, there have long been whispers that she might one day pursue elected office, possibly even a Senate seat or higher. In that context, having intimate knowledge of how global power systems function, especially one as historically entrenched and uniquely structured as the British monarchy, could be a powerful asset. Naturally, these remain theories. Some are grounded in plausible logic, others stray into speculation. But the continued lack of a clear explanation from Meghan only adds fuel to the fire. To date, she has never publicly acknowledged recording any royal meetings. Her representatives have categorically denied the allegations, labeling them as part of an ongoing smear campaign by the monarchy, an attempt, they argue, to destroy her credibility. And with no direct confirmation or denial from either side, the public is left to read between the lines. True to form, the royal family has said nothing. Their long-standing tradition of silence remains intact, they refuse to publicly address the controversy. But their silence is not without meaning. Meghan's titles have been revoked. Invitations to official events have stopped. Her portrait, once proudly displayed alongside other senior royals, has been quietly taken down. In royal circles, such actions speak louder than any press release. In the language of the palace, this was not subtle, it was absolute. This is no longer just a story of family disagreements or cultural tension. It has become a matter of trust, of privacy, of loyalty, and of betrayal, within one of the most tightly protected institutions in the world. Whether Meghan's alleged actions stemmed from ambition, fear, retaliation, or self-preservation, the consequences have been far-reaching. A line has been crossed, and the impact of that breach will echo within the monarchy for years to come. Teams moved through halls that had stood untouched for decades. ChatGPT de NOI, the British monarchy is far more than a ceremonial symbol. It is a complex institution, upheld by centuries of rules, rituals, and invisible boundaries designed not merely for tradition's sake, but as systems of protection, carefully constructed to preserve its dignity, security, and authority. While the world sees the grandeur, state banquets, coronations, parades, and balcony appearances, there's another side, one far less visible. Behind the public stage lies a tightly controlled operation, run with the discipline of a military command. Every gesture, every sentence, every movement follows established royal protocol. So when news broke that Meghan Markle had allegedly recorded private royal meetings, the palace understood immediately, this wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a direct breach of that system. This wasn't about a family argument or a misstep in etiquette. It was a rupture in the unseen layer that protects the monarchy's inner workings. Within that layer rests a framework of confidentiality and security that has safeguarded the royal institution for generations. To those outside the palace, the gravity of the situation may be hard to grasp. But for those inside, it was as if a bomb had gone off. Because what Meghan's alleged actions represented wasn't merely a lack of respect, it was a potential threat. She wasn't accused of casually overhearing private gossip. The suggestion was that she had deliberately recorded highly sensitive discussions, conversations that touched on national matters, diplomatic planning, and decisions that could shape the monarchy's future role in a post-Brexit Britain. Every royal residence operates under strict internal security protocols, on par with high-level government facilities. Though the monarchy isn't a political body in the legislative sense, its members regularly receive classified briefings. They hold meetings with top-ranking military officers, intelligence officials, prime ministers, and foreign dignitaries. And some of those meetings occurred in the very rooms where Meghan reportedly placed recording devices. The implications were staggering. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, an emergency risk assessment was launched. According to sources close to the palace, the inquiry wasn't limited to internal affairs. Senior figures from British intelligence were brought in quietly to evaluate whether any aspect of national security had been compromised. Their conclusions were never made public. But what followed was unmistakable, a complete internal overhaul. Room by room, royal residences were swept. Electronic counter-surveillance teams moved methodically through halls that, in some cases, hadn't been checked in decades. Nothing was left to chance. Furniture was taken apart, walls were tapped for hidden devices, and every inch of wiring was inspected. Advanced surveillance detection systems were installed to monitor for unauthorized transmissions or signal interference. Equipment once used to secure conversations from eavesdropping was either upgraded or completely replaced. Personal electronics, which had previously been allowed in lower security meeting rooms, were now banned entirely from almost all private royal gatherings. Every aide, assistant, and staff member within the royal household underwent new rounds of vetting. Those who had been close to Meghan during her time in the palace were questioned again. Background checks were reopened. Access logs were combed through. Every standard, every long-standing assumption about internal security, was suddenly up for review. But the technological response was only part of the fallout. The psychological damage was arguably even more severe. Trust, once considered the bedrock of royal life, had been shattered. A family that had long believed its inner sanctum was impenetrable now found itself watching its own shadows. Paranoia began to creep in. Meetings were shortened. Some opted to communicate through handwritten notes rather than risk speaking aloud. Others stopped talking altogether when inside certain rooms. The once seamless rhythm of internal communication was replaced by guarded silence and second-guessing. Even routine discussions, like those about ceremonial military events, had to be reassessed. Royal visits abroad were delayed or rerouted. Security protocols for King Charles, Prince William, and their families were elevated to a higher threshold. Meghan may never have shared the recordings, but the mere fact that the devices had been there introduced an element of uncertainty. And in royal operations, uncertainty is simply unacceptable. Perhaps the most painful realization was that this breach hadn't come from an outsider, it had come from someone who had been fully embraced. Meghan hadn't forced her way into the family. She was invited. Welcomed. Celebrated in a royal wedding broadcast around the globe. She had stood beside Queen Elizabeth II, dined with then Prince Charles, and shared light-hearted moments with Princess Anne. Her betrayal wasn't just a break in confidentiality. It was a blow to a belief system, the belief that the monarchy could evolve, that it could adapt to modernity without compromising its core values. That hope was now fractured. Within the royal family, loyalty has always been the highest currency, worth more than protocol, more than privilege, even more than blood. And in the wake of this scandal, that currency had lost much of its value. The betrayal didn't just prompt tighter security, it triggered a deeper, philosophical shift in how the monarchy would function. Invitations became fewer. Access was narrowed. Even long-trusted figures found themselves under new restrictions. The Queen's former private secretary was reportedly brought out of retirement to offer counsel on containment strategies. Veteran security operatives with backgrounds in counterintelligence were brought in to retrain palace staff. Confidentiality contracts were revised and expanded. According to some royal biographers, changes were even made to palace architecture, subtle modifications designed to enhance physical and digital security, reinforcing barriers both seen and unseen. And the consequences didn't stop at Buckingham Palace. Government officials began quietly raising questions about what Meghan might have learned, and whether she still had access to any classified or sensitive information. Though the Cabinet Office made no public statement, it's believed they participated in several closed-door meetings focused solely on managing potential national security risks. While the monarchy is officially apolitical, its inner workings touch nearly every aspect of national influence, from diplomatic relations to ceremonial roles involving the military. The notion that someone who was no longer part of the institution could have access to, or potentially expose, such sensitive information sent shockwaves through palace corridors. It wasn't just about internal breach, it was about the risk of that knowledge slipping beyond the Crown's control. Then there was the public. Even though the palace offered no official comment, the consequences spoke for themselves. Meghan's quiet removal from royal communications, the revocation of her titles, and her increasing absence from public royal functions made it clear, something serious had occurred. Something the institution was unwilling to forgive. Public sentiment, already fractured in the wake of her earlier interviews and media appearances, became even more polarized. For some, the changes confirmed their long-held suspicions. For others, it stirred new debates. But one thing was clear, whatever had happened behind palace walls had left a mark that could no longer be hidden. Supporters of the monarchy quickly rallied, reaffirming their loyalty in the face of scandal, while Meghan's defenders accused the palace of orchestrating a character assassination without offering any public evidence. But within royal walls, there was no wavering. The alleged recordings had breached protocol in a way no previous controversy ever had. Not even the highly public divorces of Charles and Diana, the constitutional crisis surrounding King Edward VIII, or the ongoing scandals involving Prince Andrew had directly threatened the monarchy's operational integrity. Meghan's actions, however, had done just that. Her alleged recordings forced the institution to confront difficult, uncomfortable questions. Should access to sensitive internal meetings be granted based solely on one's title or personal relationship to a royal? Should emotional bonds override established security boundaries, and should future spouses receive formal clearance and training before being permitted into confidential settings? These were no longer theoretical questions, they demanded immediate answers. Behind closed doors, a new, unspoken royal protocol began to form. Though never publicly announced, it was unmistakable in tone: discretion over warmth, security over openness, structure over sentiment. Meghan may not have intended to leave this kind of legacy, but within the palace, she became a turning point, the cautionary tale that redefined how the institution would operate moving forward. The day the royal family confronted Meghan Markle is now regarded, privately, as one of the most emotionally charged and pivotal moments in recent royal history. There were no flashing cameras. No staged statements. No headlines hinting at the intensity of what was unfolding behind the scenes. Yet within the quiet, secure confines of Windsor Castle, a confrontation took place that marked the definitive end of Meghan's chapter as a member of the royal family. The decision to convene the meeting was not made lightly. Days, possibly even weeks, had passed since the final device had been uncovered. During that time, the evidence had been thoroughly reviewed by the palace's most trusted advisors. The surveillance footage, which showed Meghan discreetly placing a device beneath a chair's armrest during a night when the room was believed to be empty, was clear and undeniable. Her movements were deliberate. The timeline aligned perfectly. Security logs corroborated every detail. King Charles, Prince William, Princess Anne, and Queen Camilla had each seen the footage. None of them said much, but the silence in the room had been heavy, definitive. There was only one step left, to confront Meghan directly. Not through lawyers. Not through letters. But in person. No room for ambiguity. No possibility for denial. The location chosen for the meeting was the Crimson Drawing Room at Windsor Castle, a space steeped in tradition and formality, yet secluded enough to ensure absolute discretion. The curtains were drawn. Phones and electronics were banned. Security was stationed nearby, instructed to guard the privacy of the meeting without encroaching. Prince Harry, though deeply connected to the matter, was informed, but not invited to attend. Meghan arrived dressed with her usual poise, elegant and composed. Her expression gave nothing away. If she had any inkling of what the meeting was about, she didn't show it. Aides who witnessed her arrival said she appeared calm, detached, even resigned, as though she had already accepted whatever was about to come. The atmosphere in the room was thick, not with rage, but with something heavier, disappointment. A solemn, restrained intensity filled the space, the kind that didn't require shouting to be understood. King Charles, known for his careful composure, opened the meeting with deliberate calm. He laid out the facts, speaking slowly and choosing his words with almost painful care. He explained what had been discovered, the hidden devices, the investigation, the surveillance footage that confirmed it all. There were no accusations hurled across the table, no emotional outbursts. Just the truth, presented plainly. When he finished, the room fell silent. All eyes turned to Meghan. For a moment, she said nothing. The silence, brief as it was, felt like it stretched on forever. Then, in a voice steady but cool, she asked a question that caught everyone off guard: why would I record anything if I already knew I wasn't welcome? It wasn't a denial. She didn't challenge the evidence. Instead, her response deflected attention away from the act itself and onto the environment, pointing to feelings of exclusion, rejection, and tension that had reportedly followed her since her arrival in the family. Princess Anne, who had stayed silent until that point, responded with just one sentence: "You were trusted." From her, those words carried the full weight of the monarchy. They weren't meant to wound. They weren't meant to provoke. They were a reminder of the expectations Meghan had entered with, and the silent contract she was believed to have broken. Despite all their differences, cultural, personal, institutional, Meghan had been welcomed into the family with the same assumption given to all who join it: loyalty above all else. At that moment, Meghan's composure began to waver. Witnesses said her voice began to tremble slightly as she gave her version of events. She described feeling isolated, monitored, manipulated. She said she never meant to harm anyone, that the recordings were never intended for release or exploitation, but as a means of self-protection in a system where she often felt unsafe and unsupported. But for the royal family, seasoned in the quiet politics of duty and discretion, her words did little to sway the room. Queen Camilla reportedly kept her eyes lowered, unable to meet Meghan's gaze. Prince William, who had once embraced her as family, sat rigid, hands tightly clasped, his expression unreadable. King Charles, still composed, brought the meeting to a close with quiet finality. He informed Meghan that all remaining ties to the royal family were being officially and permanently severed. Her titles would be rescinded. Her security access revoked. Her ceremonial and personal privileges withdrawn. There would be no press statement, no public spectacle, but the decision would be absolute. The silence that followed was, by many accounts, one of the most difficult moments any of them had experienced. For Meghan, it was the unmistakable confirmation that she was no longer welcome, not just in status, but in spirit. And for the royal family, it was the painful realization that despite every effort, they had failed to fully bring her into the fold, and were now forced to let her go, for good. There were no farewells, no final words exchanged. Meghan, composed even in the face of rejection, stood, politely thanked the royals for their time, and walked out. As the doors closed behind her, a significant chapter in the royal family's history ended, not with fanfare, but with a painful and dignified silence. What followed happened quickly and discreetly. Within days, every official trace of Meghan was systematically removed. Her name was omitted from upcoming event programs. Her portraits were quietly taken down from royal residences. Staff who had once been assigned to assist her were quietly reassigned without announcement. On the surface, to the public eye, nothing seemed out of place. But within palace walls, everyone understood, there had been a reckoning, and it had come to its conclusion. The decision was absolute. For Meghan, it marked a dramatic shift. Stripped of her title and duties, she stepped fully into the role of outsider, free from the constraints of royal life, but also cut off from its protections. That single meeting would send ripples through her world, shaping everything from her business dealings and philanthropic efforts to her marriage and public reputation. For the royal family, it served as a powerful reminder, even within the House of Windsor, tradition and trust are not automatic, they must be upheld. The monarchy, which had weathered abdications, scandals, and constitutional crises, had been wounded from within. And yet, as it has done for centuries, it responded not with spectacle, but with quiet, calculated resolve, the kind of decisive silence only an institution built on endurance can maintain. In the aftermath of every scandal, there's always one figure who remains wrapped in mystery. In this case, that enigma is Prince Harry. While Meghan Markle became the focal point of the controversy, accused of secretly recording private royal meetings and ultimately cut off from the institution, the public's attention quickly shifted to the man beside her. One question echoed louder than the rest: what did Harry know? Was he complicit? It was a question that weighed heavily, not just within the palace, but around the world. For those who had long seen Harry as the affable, kind-hearted prince, the one who walked behind his mother's coffin, served in the military, and brought humanity to the royal image, the idea that he may have known about or supported Meghan's alleged actions was difficult to accept. But inside the monarchy, the conversation was more complicated. Harry had already distanced himself from the institution in countless ways, publicly criticizing its culture, challenging its structure, and aligning himself more closely with Meghan than with the traditions of the crown. For some, it seemed increasingly unlikely that he was completely unaware. Yet, when the investigation into the recordings concluded, it found no concrete evidence tying Harry to the act. His fingerprints weren't on any of the recovered devices. Security footage never showed him alone in the compromised rooms. There were no audio files linking him to the installation or planning of any surveillance. Legally, he was in the clear. But in a family where perception carries as much weight as proof, that wasn't enough to silence suspicion. Inside the palace, a more subtle question began to emerge, not whether Harry had acted, but whether he had known and chosen not to intervene. After all, he and Meghan had long expressed their disillusionment with royal life. In interviews, they spoke openly about feeling silenced, unsupported, and cast aside. Harry had publicly wrestled with his role from an early age, speaking about his mother's suffering, his personal trauma, and his growing belief that the system he was born into no longer aligned with his values. Given this emotional and ideological separation, some within the royal household couldn't help but wonder, if Meghan had chosen to record, would Harry have seen it as betrayal, or simply as a necessary safeguard? Was he perhaps willfully ignorant, allowing it to happen under the guise of not wanting to know? Palace aides recalled small, unsettling moments that only later raised red flags. There were times Harry would arrive late to confidential meetings or excuse himself altogether, citing scheduling conflicts. One aide remembered him quietly leaving a particularly sensitive meeting after a hushed exchange with Meghan. At the time, it seemed harmless. But in hindsight, it suggested the possibility that Harry may have been intentionally stepping back, not necessarily to conspire, but to avoid being entangled. Whether out of unease, loyalty, or an effort to maintain plausible deniability, his absence spoke volumes. Then came the matter of the devices themselves. While Meghan was caught on camera placing one of the recorders, questions arose about the others, those hidden in locations that would have required more knowledge, more access. Some of the placements seemed too precise, too concealed to have been done without help. And if there was anyone who knew the royal residences inside and out, it was Harry. Having spent his entire life in those palaces, he knew every corridor, every hidden doorway. No hard evidence linked Harry to the placement of the devices. But the thought lingered, unspoken yet persistent. When he was briefed on the investigation's findings, sources say he sat in silence for a long while. He didn't jump to Meghan's defense, nor did he question the validity of the evidence. He simply asked for time, to process, to think. It wasn't until after Meghan had been formally confronted and removed from the royal fold that Harry made his position known. According to those close to him, he was torn, caught between the woman he loved and the family that shaped him. Between the freedom he had sought and the duty he could never fully escape. In the days following Meghan's departure, he reportedly requested a private meeting with his father. That meeting did happen, but under carefully controlled circumstances. It wasn't held at Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle, but at a secluded estate in the countryside, far from the cameras, far from the noise. Only Charles and Harry were present. What passed between them remains confidential, but those familiar with the situation say it was a turning point. Harry didn't deny that Meghan had acted alone. He expressed regret, even sorrow, for how things unfolded, but he didn't condemn her. He asked for compassion. He urged the family not to pursue legal action. He insisted he still believed in the idea of family, even if their ties had frayed beyond repair. Charles, as both a father and a king, offered no blanket forgiveness. But he also didn't shut the door. According to insiders, he told Harry that while the monarchy could never condone betrayal, it would always allow room for redemption. It was a quiet but meaningful gesture, one that left Harry with a choice. William's response, however, was far colder. Years of tension had already driven a wedge between the brothers. The scandal involving Meghan only made that divide deeper. Palace insiders suggest that William was the least willing to forgive. He believed Harry should have stepped in, should have stopped things before they went too far. In his eyes, Harry's silence had become complicity. There was talk of arranging a meeting between the two brothers, but William declined. Publicly, Harry remained quiet. He made no statements about the recordings. He offered no defense of Meghan, nor did he issue any apology. To some, his silence was damning, a sign that he had been involved all along. To others, it was simply a man trying to preserve the little privacy he had left. In the months that followed, Harry retreated. He spent most of his time in California, away from the cameras and the headlines. He cancelled scheduled appearances, skipped several major royal events, and remained noticeably absent from occasions where his presence once seemed guaranteed. Invitations from the palace weren't withdrawn, but they were no longer automatic. They came with caution. Whether Harry had a role in the scandal may never be fully known. He wasn't caught on tape. He wasn't seen planting devices. There's no footage or recording of him discussing any surveillance plan. But the man who had once stood proudly behind his mother's coffin, who had served on the front lines in Afghanistan, who had won the hearts of millions for his openness and vulnerability, was now someone the palace could no longer fully trust. And perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of all. Harry's part in this story isn't defined solely by what he did or didn't do. It's defined by what he didn't say. In a family built on loyalty, his silence, his failure to question, to intervene, to take a stand, was seen as betrayal all the same. The fallout from Meghan Markle's exposure didn't unfold with dramatic headlines or sudden spectacle. It was deliberate, measured, and profoundly personal. Behind the towering gates of royal estates and the composed faces shown to the public, the royal family was grappling with an internal fracture unlike any they had faced in decades. Betrayals come in many forms, but this one struck at the core of who they were. For a family built on tradition, discretion, and unwavering loyalty, the alleged secret recordings were more than a breach of privacy, they were a violation of the institution's very foundation. In the days immediately following Meghan's confrontation, a heavy silence blanketed the palace. There were no press briefings. No carefully placed leaks. No official statements released to the media. In keeping with its long-held approach, the monarchy said nothing. But within the palace walls, conversations were taking place, some emotional, others cold and pragmatic. All were weighty. King Charles, now firmly seated on the throne after the passing of Queen Elizabeth II, carried the responsibility of the institution on his shoulders. He had always been a complicated figure, shaped by duty but often scrutinized by the public. Now, he had to lead through a crisis unlike any his mother had faced. Queen Elizabeth had managed through scandals and wayward family members, but even she had never dealt with someone allegedly recording private strategy sessions from within. According to insiders, Charles took a step back, not to retreat, but to reflect. He spent several days in seclusion, consulting with senior advisors, experienced courtiers, and a select group of trusted legal experts. Every decision he made in this moment would set precedent, not just for how the family handled this scandal, but for how it would manage future threats to its inner sanctum. Sources say that Charles wasn't outwardly furious, but he was deeply shaken. Not because conflict with Harry and Meghan was unexpected, but because he had genuinely believed that, after the Oprah interview, the release of Harry's memoir, and the family's public efforts to show unity, they had weathered the worst. This, however, proved him wrong. In the end, Charles chose to respond with firm restraint. Meghan's titles and privileges were quietly revoked. Her name disappeared from internal family communications. Invitations to royal events were withdrawn. Financial support tied to her position was quietly cut. There was no press release, but the silence spoke volumes. Those familiar with royal protocol understood exactly what had taken place. Queen Camilla, often more emotionally intuitive than portrayed, was devastated. While never especially close to Meghan, she had held out hope that time and patience could mend the divide. She had supported Meghan's inclusion in events, encouraged Charles to maintain a line of communication with Harry, and even proposed a private family retreat to help ease tensions. The revelation that Meghan had allegedly violated the family's trust left Camilla heartbroken. Behind closed doors, she reportedly cried, not for herself, but for the pain inflicted on Charles, on Harry, and on the crown itself. Prince William's reaction, however, was the most unforgiving. Of all the royals, he had perhaps made the greatest effort early on to welcome Meghan. He had offered guidance, extended warmth, and tried to act as a steady older brother to help her navigate the complexities of royal life. But as the situation grew more strained and public clashes escalated, William's patience wore thin. By the time the alleged recordings were uncovered, whatever goodwill Prince William had once held toward Meghan had already eroded. But this revelation pushed him beyond frustration, it became a matter of principle. According to several palace insiders, William was the most adamant about enforcing a complete break. He saw the recordings not as a misunderstanding, but as an intentional act of betrayal. His trust, once lost, was irretrievable. He reportedly confided to aides that there could be no forgiveness for this kind of violation. Allowing Meghan to remain tied to the royal family, even symbolically, would, in his eyes, dishonor everything the monarchy stood for. Though he may not have said it directly, William also placed emotional blame on Harry. He ceased all personal contact with his brother, limiting communication strictly to matters of official business. For William, the boundary was clear. This wasn't just about security or protocol, it was personal. He believed Harry had stood silently while Meghan dismantled the sanctity of their most private spaces. And for that, reconciliation would not come anytime soon. Princess Anne, whose sharp observation and swift action had sparked the entire investigation, remained calm, focused, and unsentimental. Though she rarely spoke about the incident, even within palace walls, her presence loomed large. Many credited her with averting a much greater disaster. Had she not acted when she did, had those devices remained undetected, the damage could have reached far beyond the family. In private, and carried on as she always had, disciplined, reliable, and exacting. But her stature within the royal household subtly changed. No longer seen as merely the reliable daughter of Queen Elizabeth II, she had become the monarchy's unofficial guardian of tradition. When Anne spoke, the family listened, and she seldom needed to say anything twice. Even the younger royals, those not yet burdened by official duties, felt the weight of the shift. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis were too young to grasp the full implications, but changes rippled into their lives too. Their routines were adjusted, their security increased. The palace had always been cautious, but now it was on high alert. Trust, even among family, could no longer be assumed. It had to be earned. Staff members felt it too. Long-serving aides who had worked under multiple monarchs began to whisper quietly in hallways. Every conversation with a royal became more measured, more calculated. New protocols were implemented. Meeting rooms were swept more often. Briefings were shorter, more structured. The relaxed rhythm that had once characterized behind-the-scenes life was gone, replaced by a persistent undercurrent of vigilance. The consequences spilled beyond the palace walls. Meghan's absence from public engagements did not go unnoticed. Her quiet removal from the royal family's official website drew the attention of reporters. Royal correspondents speculated endlessly, but the palace stayed silent, neither confirming nor denying the rumors. That silence only intensified the spotlight, with her absence generating more headlines than any official statement ever could. Among the public, reactions were sharply divided. For some, the palace's response felt like long-awaited vindication.